Shalom, welcome to Rivkush, a CJN podcast featuring conversations with Jews of color discussing all things Jewish. And I also want to say, welcome us back, because we had a wee bit of a vacation / hiatus, and so now we're back with season 2. And to kick off season 2, I am so pleased to have Joel Etienne, who I always also want to say Yaakov because of the signs. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Joel. Joel, he has an impressive CV. So I'm trying to condense it and we'll dive into it during our conversation. So let's start off with, he's originally from New Brunswick. He graduated with a law degree from the University of Moncton. Joel is also a TV producer and creator. He created and produced a show called Rising Suns. He's currently directing his first feature movie called The Rabbi's Daughter. Another aspect of Joel, I told you there's a lot, is he's very involved in his synagogue. It keeps him busy. And from what I understand, he's currently working on the beginning steps of merging 2 synagogues. And last but certainly not least, and I kind of alluded to it when I said Yaakov, you would have seen his signs in and around York Central because he is the candidate of record for the Conservative Party of Canada for York Centre. So, welcome, Joel. That was a mouthful. I am so glad to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. A little tired, Monday afternoons, getting into the rhythm of the week, but such a pleasure and an honor to be here in your presence. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Joel, I've been trying to have a conversation with you for a while now because we've sort of connected on Facebook eons ago when I was, and I just had a thought, when I was at the beginning throes of my documentary, which I'm telling you, by the time it's done, I'll be like 90. But maybe I need somebody like you to get on board with it and take it out of the hands of the amateur.
It's television, film projects, documentaries. It's always a work in progress, and even when it's finished, you always wish you could have added to it, right? So it's always a little frustrating.
Okay, so let's talk about that because essentially you're a lawyer, law and order and all that good stuff. I find law fascinating. So essentially you're a lawyer, but you've obviously made a conscious decision to go into entertainment. So tell me a wee bit about what led you to that.
It's always in the path of life. It's always one experience that leads you to another, and an opportunity that leads you to another opportunity. Years ago, I think I started living with the mindset of just not saying no to crazy initiatives and crazy ideas. A friend of mine who was a founder of a television network, at one point in time, segued from television drama that was produced and filmed principally in Mandarin, came to me. And they were putting together an English-speaking envelope, and he had the idea of, let's create a law show, a little bit at like Law and Order, etc. You're a lawyer, let's make a legal show. And at that point in time, I felt that the genre was really tired. How many spin-offs of Law and Order do you have, and how many police officer shows do you have? Television was just rife with it. And I thought, look, I think the Canadian experience of having the clash of cultures in the Greater Toronto area that we have, based on wonderful multiculturalism, is really a setup for much more interesting drama in the range of in the environment of diversity. And my feeling was, let's not constrain ourselves with the legal format. We can use it. We can have lawyers in the show, for example, and we do, right? But life is much more multifaceted than the courtroom experience only. And I thought, let's just widen the boundaries of what television should look like, and let's make sure that what we have is really varied elements of our multicultural world speaking truth to each other, and in a position of power speaking truth to each other, because what we wanted to do, and I think we've achieved it in The Rising Suns, our drama, our English scripted drama that we had a first season on Omni. We're about to start shooting a second season, further episodes. And what we wanted to do that felt was different than other television shows was, get away from tokenism and stereotypes. The Hollywood formula for multiculturalism is, the innocent, the funny immigrant kind who has, who needs the guidance of the quintessential established, Canadian or American to give them guidance in terms of how to navigate the world itself.
It's almost
the
like a
or the guide
white savior
or the
kind of thing without actually saying it like I did. Yeah?
It's a tired formula, and it's the formula of Perfect Strangers, the comedy of the 1980s with Bronson Pinchot, and and it's always right, and that's how it started, right? And it's always it's always the derivative of the theme, right? And I thought that the genre is tired, and I'm fairly and always frustrated by what the major Canadian broadcasters put out in terms of multicultural fare, and it's not just me. I mean, Russell. I remember an interview. I think it was on Q with Gomeshi when he was hosting Q between Russell Peters and Gian, where Russell Peters was really complaining about the fact that whether it's Little Mosque on the Prairie or Kim's Convenience, the comedy genre, the ethnic community as being funny and innocent, and again with the savior model of wisdom and guidance and intelligence coming from only one corner of the discussion. And I thought that to me the greater Toronto multicultural community has evolved much more beyond that. There's much more maturity, and I think what we have on a daily basis in the 416 or in the 905 are mature voices speaking truth to each other. Sometimes saying things that we want to, sometimes saying things that we need to hear, that we want to hear, sometimes that we don't want to hear. But it's a dialogue of mature communities and mature individuals speaking to each other, and that's what I did not see on television or in movies. And it's really been for me the guiding thread of the type of productions that we want to create.
Right.
And so there is humor is always a good vehicle. There is humor in what we put together, but at the same time, it is trying to keep that level of maturity and that voice of equality throughout the dialogue with the varied communities that are speaking to each other.
Absolutely. So, Joel, I know your father, Joel Etienne, he was from Haiti, correct?
Correct.
So do you is part of how you see yourself or experiences that you had growing up as a child of an immigrant and as a Jew of color, did this form any of your work?
I think it's central to everything that I do. My father's human rights experience and my father's experience as an immigrant. I mean, it was bilateral. It was on both sides of the family. My father arrived in Canada in 1964. He was a political exile from Haiti. He fled Haiti, for his life. He had been involved in human rights in Haiti at the time. Duvalier dictatorship, the father's dictatorship, two Duvalier dictatorships, father and the son.
Papa and Baby Doc, yeah.
Been involved. So Papa Dog gave my father lots of trouble. My father tried to give Papa Dog lots of trouble, and he almost. I mean, he was jailed. He was tortured. He paid a heavy price for it. Then he was exiled. He arrived in Canada in 1994 in Montreal. My grandfather was and my grandmother, both heroes of the French Resistance during the Second World War. Fought the Nazis. Dreamed of a way to find a way out of Europe after the war, and ultimately made it to Canada in 1968 with their 6 children. So we have the minority experience, the experience of persecution on both sides of the family. Right. And so certainly that's been a guiding thread for me. I graduated. My first law degree was from the University of Montreal. And,
my apologies.
I remember upon graduating. Oh, that's okay. That's fine. That's great. but I went to that law school because it has a high degree of specialization in administrative law, government law, constitutional law, and certainly the reflex as a minority is to try to understand how is it that I can protect it, my family, myself,
Right.
and the minority communities around me, and building these skills of protection, if you will, to create a shield around you.
Yes.
And it was a great school for that because it really is the school. It is a school that is specialized in that field because it was really the voice, the institutional voice of French-speaking Canada, and all the constitutional reforms that Canada had, including the charter, really find their roots in that school.
Okay.
And I remember graduating, and my father told me, "Oh, absolutely, you would have no charter of rights or freedoms if it wasn't for that university, both the provincial charters of rights and the federal one as well." I mean, conceptually, it was an entire academia that was built around finding ways to advance the protective rights of the French-speaking factor in North America, of the Québécois and French Canadians, but at the same time, learning their tools of trade was obviously useful for other minorities as well.
Absolutely.
And even though it happens to be a very conservative school, I wouldn't say that it's a school that has any type of sensitivity at the time, certainly for minority rights. But at the same time, it was a good school in terms of learning the tricks of the trade, if you will. So I'm certainly grateful for that. My father, made it a point to make sure that I understood that the skills that I got had to be redistributed, right? That I dedicated my life to as much as I could, do as much pro bono work that I could, and helping the widows and the orphan. And in that context, really, it's the same theme, whether it's in my law practice, or in the media work, or in the political work. It is the idea of advancing opportunities and advancing the rights and the emancipation of minorities, whether it's Chinese Canadians who are fighting for pro-democracy rights in terms of fighting the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's visible minority rights, religious rights in the community. There's always that theme for me. So whatever the project is, whether it's television, writing, or the law, that's really that's been the guiding.
So is that kind of then explains why you also went into immigration and really built up your immigration practice, was because of that, giving back and making,
Sure. I mean, it's a fascinating reality, but having the proper any burgeoning or new community in the country needs good immigration counsel, right?
True.
And what's fascinating for me is that if you speak to individuals in the Jewish community whose families arrived post-war, 1950s, 1960s, and you hear their settlement stories, they're absolutely no different than the settlement stories of my Caribbean clients or my Chinese clients or South Asian clients or African clients. Really the same. You hear the same frustrations that they had, the same difficulties, the same dangers of deportation, etc. It's an amazing thing. What I also find amazing is how quickly the trauma is forgotten. Right? That's been a fascinating experience. You go one generation or second generation, and they have no idea what their grandparents or the great grandparents went through. Yeah. And even with communities that I've worked with, that I've settled over 2 decades, the challenges of today are certainly not the challenges of yesterday. And it's quickly put behind you, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
But yes. I started out in what I call the heavy litigation of doing, the big murder cases, because it provides you with a set of skills when you can. Not a lot of lawyers get to argue in front of juries. Not a lot of lawyers get to build the experiences of having the pressure of having clients who face, the rest of their lives incarcerated.
Right.
So I wanted to. I think it's a personality thing for me. I like to take on the big challenges. Sometimes I do break my teeth taking on the big challenges, but I'm that type of person who wants to see what's on the other side of the curtain, or what's on the other side of the door. It's not always the smartest thing to do. I'll grant you that. But if you can go full circle and get that learning experience, then I think it serves you much better. And then you're also not scared of the boogeyman, and you're not scared of the unknown, right? And that's always been very important for me. And those litigation skills that I acquired in criminal law initially and early on, being blessed to being able to have those experiences. I mean, I was doing my first murder trial 6 months in. After being,
I would have been shaken like a leaf.
You're right. Too early, and it was clearly nuts. And I don't know that I would recommend it to somebody else who would be calling me and telling me, is this a good idea? But on the other hand, you've done it. You faced your biggest fears. You've been successful at it. And then you have a wheelhouse of skills and experiences that I was very happy to bring to the immigration bar after that. Because at the time, a lot of the immigration lawyers were from the real estate bar, because it's so intense in forms and documents and paperwork. But there was certainly a minority of lawyers who came from the litigation side of the fence, more solicitors and barristers. You had some great barristers, but more solicitors. And I think what was needed at the time was some good barrister skills in terms of advancing immigration. Immigration law, the pioneers of it, whether it's the Green and Spiegels or the Mendel Greens, the Frank Moraccos, or the Lorne Waldmans, those are all folks that really started pushing immigration law as a way to practice law in the late 80s. Mid to late 80s. So it's a fairly burgeoning, at the time when I first started 22 years ago, it was still in its ascendancy as a practice. The charter was still new. I mean, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came up in 1982. So when you were practicing in 1999, 2000, 2001, you were still dealing with a field of law that was very, very fresh. So it was a great opportunity for us to get in there and really to push the envelope. Yeah.
Cool. So let's take it back a little pre-law. So growing up, you grew up then, you're originally from New Brunswick, but you grew up in Quebec, correct?
No, not at all.
No?
My parents met and found each other in Montreal.
Okay.
My mother arrived in '68, Montreal was. My father was a French academic.
Yes.
But he was not a sovereignist. He was not a separatist. Okay. That certainly was. Not akin to his values. Certainly in terms of the advancement of in Quebec, the term for multicultural communities is allophone, right? You're neither francophone or you're
anglophone. You're an allophone,
right? You're an allophone. And life for the allophones in those days was not easy.
Yeah.
And we were really, caught in that whirlwind of constitutional wrangling between the English and the French. And at the time, if you're a French-speaking academic, as my father was, there was really no place for you if you were a Federalist allophone in public affairs or in the public debate.
Okay.
And really, in order for my father to I would say be loyal and faithful to his worldview and his view of what, of Canada and what Canada should look like in the, 50 years on. His thing was, the only place where he found his, if you wish, his academic freedom as a good Canadian Federalist was in New Brunswick. New Brunswick is the ancestral home of the Acadians. French Canadians who are not Quebecois. They were called historically the French Loyalists.
Yes,
right.
I remember that from school. That much I remember.
They're very. Right? So New Brunswick is 750,000 people. It's a small province in population, but almost half of the population is Acadien, French Canadians. And they have a university in Moncton, which is really their cultural and political and sociological hub. And that's where my father found a home, in that French-speaking university, where he became the founder of the journalism school. So I was born and raised in Moncton.
Okay.
And I was there till the age of 18, where I left.
All right.
Where I left to go to law law school after that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you're Acadian by way of
So I'm
New
an Acadian
Brunswick. Yeah, yeah.
by way of
So,
birth and adoption. Yeah.
yeah. So here's the thing. What was the Jewish community like growing up, and how did you navigate the Jewish community in New Brunswick?
Well, the Jewish community in Brunswick was very small. It was an ancestral community that they've been there for generations. Moncton at the time was I would say 90% of the community were Lithuanian Jews who had been there for a very long time. There were a few families that had immigrated after the war, Holocaust survivors, and then a few outlier families, such as my family, who were really anchored by the university there. So it was certainly a good representation of Greater Canada, if you will. That little shoal. We were francophones, but the shoal was, I would say, 90% anglophone, English speaking. And it was very, very traditional. I mean, you had families who had been, for example, feuding since back in the day in Lithuania, where this family won't marry to that family. It happened in the old country, etc. And so it was very, very tribal that way. But and Jews who had struggled because there had been serious anti-Semitism historically in Atlantic Canada. It wasn't easy for them, but who had really learned to punch above their weight. So Moncton, for example, had a Jewish mayor in the 1950s.
Oh, okay.
One of our most famous co-religionists was a gentleman named Reuben Cohen, who is the founder of Central Trust, and he started out as a he went to Dalhousie, became a lawyer, couldn't find work in the big law firms, and basically created his own bank. And Central Trust eventually merged with Canada Trust and TD. So he's one of the founders of TD. Back in the 80s, when I was being raised in Moncton, Reuben was the 10th richest man in Canada, with his private jet waiting for him at the airport. But humble man, simple man, community person, greatest person on the planet. So I grew up with these Monctonians who had struggled, but who had really, really learned to punch above their weight class.
How was the
we a little shoal of 100 families. Yeah.
Sorry, how was like the racial diversity? Because when I think of the East Coast, I know there's diversity there, but it hasn't always been friendly, shall we say, when I think of the East Coast, in particular, more so Nova Scotia. But however, what was it like in terms of that even?
It's a fascinating thing. And certainly I should, open the parenthesis to say that life as I understand it now in Atlantic Canada for people of color and minorities is not what it was when I was growing up. The last time I was in Atlantic Canada and came back, I remember saying, to my spouse and friends, the trauma of the past is really, I'm dealing with the ghosts of the past, that it's not the reality of 30 years ago is not the reality of today. And, I should be very careful not to conflate both. But if I'm going to be, frank and honest and open about the history, I would say that you were dealing with a very complex society. The provinces are very, very different. So Moncton is a 40-minute drive from the Nova Scotia border. But the experiences that we had as racialized Jews in Moncton was incredibly different than the experience of racialized Jews in Yarmouth, in Halifax, in Dartmouth, in Nova Scotia. I mean, you do know that from an ancestral perspective, you have, the African Canadian community of Nova Scotia that hail from,
the United
centuries.
States, from
they
slavery.
They came as loyalists. Yep. They came as loyalists. They fought for crown, for king and country, and in exchange for their loyal service, really got treated very, very badly in terms of. I remember my family having very difficult experiences in Nova Scotia ourselves. But that border that was 40 kilometers away was almost a shield to us having the same experiences in Moncton, and it was very strange. So as a young person person of color in Moncton. I mean, I think there were 4 or 5 other kids that were racialized like
And
me.
I bet you know their names.
But, sure, of course, I grew up with them. I love them,
Yes, because that's how I grew up. I can tell you their names,
right?
of people around me.
Of course, we consider each other family to this day.
Yeah.
But everybody in town knew that if you were a kid of color, your father was probably a doctor or a university professor. So the reverse. We're a little bit treated like the kids in the French Prince of Bel-Air, if you will, right? You go to the mall and they would treat you very well because they knew that you probably had a credit card in your pocket where you could buy things that that other kids wouldn't be able to because Moncton at the time was very blue collar, not very wealthy. In terms of the folks who didn't have who weren't integrated in the professions, and so there was, I would say, in the city itself, perhaps a positive bias.
Interesting.
And it was that type of experience. It was it's very bizarre, but I mean, I remember, for example, late 70s, my parents went to Halifax to buy some fancy furniture, and the plan was to go and sleep in a hotel room. And of course, as soon as we arrived at the nice hotel and they saw my parents, the rule, they had lost the reservation. And I remember my parents going from hotel to hotel to motel to hotel, and then we ended up sleeping in the car because they couldn't find anything. That was a typical experience of an interracial, racialized couple in Nova Scotia at the time, right? So you still had that blended life where past the little boundaries of your little circle of existence, yes, we saw, what the worst of society had to offer. But, do remember that there was a time in Nova Scotia where, people, racialized people of color wouldn't be able to, sit where the white folks sat, at the movie theater.
Yeah, it's a piece of history that I think we forget about too.
Yeah, sure. And so in terms of the Jewish community, it was very blended that way because, wonderful anecdotes where, for example, there was we had a Yom Kippur where one side of the community was fighting with the other side of the community, and all war broke out between the Lithuanians, the Litvish Jews, and at Kol Nidre, people are usually called and honored to carry the Torah, and they were so frustrated with their internal fight that they decided that the only person that deserved to carry the Torah was my dad, right? Because he wasn't part of the ancestral fight. I mean, so and it was a brawl of all brawls. I mean, broken noses and bloody faces, and they really went at it. And and they decided that my father was the good guy, right? You know what I mean? So you have these wonderful experiences of multiculturalism, where the good aspect of multiculturalism comes through. But I also remember my sister and I went to camp, to Jewish camp in Nova Scotia, where we weren't ready for the stigmas of what being black in Nova Scotia meant, what the experiences of other white Jewish kids had with black kids, and I mean, we were tortured for weeks on end. It was one of the worst experiences of my life that I can recall, right? And without actually being ready for it, right? With no pre-warning, no understanding that
because why would you? Why would you? Because
right?
You grew up in a Jewish community, you grew up as a Jew, you expect that wherever you go as a Jew, it'll be okay. So it is like it knocks you off your feet when you are faced with stuff like that, never mind as a kid.
We are very, very much, it was very, very interesting to me because, we're a bit like the canaries in the coal mines, and the diversity of North America. The regional diversity of North America is something that we will feel more than others because I guess if you're white Anglo-Jewish and you're in Michigan or you're in Illinois or in New York or in Florida, you'll have a standard of experience that is going to be similar within the Jewish community. Whereas our reality at that time was not the same, right? So, it's one thing to be in Shul in Moncton, and which was fine. Being in Shul in Montreal was a great community as well in terms of the acceptance of racialized reality, because Montreal had a huge influx of Holocaust survivors after the war. So there was just this automatic sensitivity to the minority factor.
Right.
Toronto was really good. But then all of a sudden you find yourself in Michigan and you're like, and it's a 4 4-hour drive from Toronto, and you expect the same experience, and no, it's not the same experience.
Yeah.
And you're in New York. I mean, I remember being in New York. Spent a lot of time in New York in the 90s, and it was after the the race riots of the 90s. Is it Bensonhurst? I forget those riots, etc. And so you could not avoid the sociological reality of what was going on the ground. But at the same time, I mean, I remember being at Lubavitch headquarters in Brooklyn, late 90s, and police presence on the street, tension between the African American community and the Jewish community. But I walk in my first Friday night, and what do you have? You've got a black Lubavitcher who's welcoming us in the synagogue too, right? Wow. So there's so much multi-dimensional and nuanced realities, even in local realities, that I've always been very cautious not to generalize, right? And to be careful not to paint an entire city or an entire town or entire community with one brush, because it's a really unfair exercise, right?
I agree. I mean, if I painted New York with the experience that I had fairly recently there, I'd probably never go back to New York again, because it was Williamsburg. Some might say, well, you went to Williamsburg. But anyways, it was Williamsburg, and I had a negative experience. But I have to recognize that experience, the negativity, came from that individual and not the city, right? When I've got my little Gabriella, who is, my wife is originally from Nova Scotia. So her ancestry is that same Lithuanian ancestry that they all have. Her father is from Cape Breton. He's an established professional in Halifax. And what side Gabriella of the Lithuanian fight is she on?
No, they're very calm in her family, so they're pretty neutral, happy with everybody. Her father's the president of the show. The only fight he has is trying to get people to Minion on a daily basis.
So the usual fight.
He's a courageous guy who tries to get 10 people to show up for show. That's his struggle. And
that struggle is real.
He gets a break from that once a year when he comes to Toronto. It really is. And he gets a break from that, once a year when he comes to Toronto for vacation. But, so Gabriella, blonde, blue eyes, to my great surprise when this child was born, because my wife's got dark eyes and she's, dark Lithuanian, she does not look Slavic at all. And I'd have my little one who's, 2-3 years old, and, I'm in Michigan with her, and people look at her and know that she's racialized, right? Ann Arbor or Dearborn, and they can tell right away that this kid is a quarter black, right? You know what I mean? And it's
that radar.
The eyes of disapproval, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you feel it. Mm-hmm. But then I'd be, in the subway in New York, right? And people are cheering. People are happy to see her. They know what that means. Or in Miami, right? So it's so interesting where that regional difference, right, makes a difference.
Wow.
And it's always been part of my, when I'm speaking to our fellow brothers and sisters, my whole thing is always, look to establish yourself in a place where, you'll be the most embraced and most accepted, because life is hard enough, because we don't just have to deal with our, ethnic realities. You have to deal with making a living and getting up in the morning and being functional and everything, every other life challenge that you have to deal with, right?
Absolutely.
Getting your mask on or getting your shot during the pandemic, right? So it's sociologically interesting. But in that context, for me, this is why Toronto was, I would call it my savior, right?
Even though you went up north?
Sorry?
Even though you're up north?
Sorry?
Even though you're up north. You're kind of fake Toronto,
me,
okay?
Is there really a border at Steele's, right? But I think that's all talk amongst ourselves.
I don't know, because I'm at Bathurst and Steele's. I'm at Bathurst and Steele's, and it's always like, oh, you live down south. You live down south.
I No, but I think that's just that's just a cultural colloquialism. I don't take it seriously. But what I do take seriously was me finishing top of my class and absolutely
Yes.
having zero opportunities for work back home in New Brunswick, and also being having every door shut in your face in Montreal, and then driving down the 401 in a $300 car at the time. And I knew when I started seeing the semi trucks and looking up and seeing brown men with turbans driving these trucks. These
Yes.
were jobs that people of color would never have back in the day in Montreal or in New Brunswick or Atlantic Canada. These good paying blue collar jobs that some are unionized, not unionized. I mean, we had no access to that as communities, right? And seeing, my first experience, I'm driving down the 401, I'm thinking, wow, look at this, like it's possible. And I landed at Bathurst and Bloor looking for the street where I could find my father, my best friend's apartments. That I crashed on his couch for 3 weeks, and the first police officer that I saw was a Caribbean police officer,
Wow.
and that's not something that I would have seen in Montreal.
Okay.
And I was like, wow, this is where a guy like me can have his chance, right? And no opportunities for work back home or in Quebec, but all of a sudden my resume has echo. All of a sudden, within 3 weeks, I'm interviewing everywhere, and I've got people giving me real job offers with, real opportunities for professional growth to make a living, etc. So, for me, that was my first 416, 905 experiences, that GTA, which, if you look at the history of Toronto in terms of diversity and multiculturalism and integration of African Black Canadians, it's always been historically, the more progressive, sociological ecosystem in the country, right? Where people can make their mark and advance in their lives. So for me, not that our society is perfect, of course.
No,
For me, it was my blessing.
Yeah, you've given me a whole other perspective because, I was born and raised in Toronto, and we see things from our own lens. And the way you've described it has kind of made me re-look at Toronto from your perspective. So I think that's pretty powerful what you said, that you saw it as opportunity and the difference.
Toronto, for the racialized, maritimer kid, was Degrassi. That's what we saw on television. And kids our age who were television stars, who were congregating in peace and in harmony and equality with white folks, that was the arc of hope, and that was not possible where we grew up.
Dang. Well, you've given me a lot.
Which is, by the way, to be fair, I was in Moncton in January. I've got clients there. Leaps and bounds has New Brunswick society evolved, right?
Okay.
Like I say, my experiences of 30 years ago, not the experiences of racialized kids growing up there. I went for a business meeting at one of the most relevant corporation in Atlantic Canada is the Irving Company. It's a huge company, petroleum, newspapers, pulp and paper, etc. I get there at the first meeting, and the most senior vice president there, and the person basically in charge is a man of color. Like, I would have never thought that would have been possible.
So that's huge
30
progress.
years ago. But today, it's huge progress, and it's a matter of fact. It's not even a question.
You don't even
not
think
even,
it is.
It's a surprise to me.
Exactly what I say about
It's
diversity.
a surprise to me because that's what I had experienced.
Yeah.
But it's not a surprise to anybody that's living there. That's just part of their daily routine, which is wonderful and beautiful.
Yeah.
So I certainly am very careful not to paint yesterday's world as today's world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when people ask me about, my thoughts around Jewish diversity, and I say to them, I said, my ultimate my ultimate goal, if you wish, is what you said. I want it to be that it isn't something that we strive for or something that is a struggle or anything like that. I just want it to be, it just is. Where this is just like you said, it was, for the people there, it's like, yeah, what's the big deal? This is just how it is.
But here's the issue, and this is what's really interesting, is that I always think that we're at the front lines of the next movement of what we see as progress. And so I think people like yourself or myself will never be quote unquote satisfied, right? Because the argument of yesteryear was representation. Can we be at the table? So do you have black judges? Yes. Do you have black police officers? Yes. Do you have extremely successful people of color in finance and in
black
all areas
executive
of life?
directors?
But right,
synagogue executive directors.
Here's the thing, too, though. Exactly. But for us today, though, it's not just about if representation means tokenism, then it's of no interest to us because that representation is no longer real. It doesn't mean anything because you could have a person of non-color in the job if the person of color can't have their voice, can't be heard, can't speak, can't participate, can't be an equal participant at the table. So I think that, the challenge of our generation or the challenge of today is to go, I think, beyond the idea of representation. It's to create meaningful representation where that representation is real and not tokenism, and that's what makes it difficult. It's not just about being in law, but it's being able to advance law. It's not just about making television or movies, but it's about advancing it, making it beyond tokenism. The same thing in the area of politics, right? Which ultimately, keeps the challenge alive because it's really the next steps of multiculturalism. Right? The final steps of multiculturalism is where none of it will ever matter. That, it'll be Martin Luther King's dream, that we're all judged for the contents of our character, there's no afterthought, and that whoever the person is at the seat will have just as much sensitivity for gender, for color, for everything else, and will have that uber maturity, right? That's the ultimate goal. Right. But to get there, you do have to have meaningful representation that's not tokenism. And so, when I'm speaking with the judges privately of color, when I'm speaking to community leaders of color privately, because this is not something that we speak about too much openly, then that's where I hear the grievances. I'm at the table, but I'm not being heard. I'm not being listened to. I'm not being able to participate. I'm very, very frustrated. Right? It's not meaningful, right? And should I leave? Should I go? And should I be fighting on the outside and not on the inside? And the beauty of it, though, is that this struggle, in terms of our community participants, is widespread, which to me means it's a good thing, because if it's the judges complaining to me and you complaining to me and everybody complaining to me, then I understand that, okay, well, this is where society is in terms of the ecosystem. This is where we're trying to push the boundaries, right? And I'm not crazy here, it's not me that's nuts, right? There's obviously there is still a lot of work to do, right? In terms of being able to have a meaningful voice at the table.
From award-winning journalist Marcia Lederman comes Kiss the Red Stairs, a compelling memoir of Holocaust survival, intergenerational trauma, divorce, and discovery that will guide readers through several lifetimes of monumental change. Marcia was 5 when a simple question led to a horrifying answer. She asked her mother why she didn't have any grandparents. Her mother told her the truth: the Holocaust. Decades later, her parents dead and herself a mother to a young son, Marcia begins to wonder how much history has shaped her own life. Reeling in the wake of a divorce, she craves her parents' help. But in their absence, she is gripped by a need to understand the trauma they suffered, and she begins her own journey into the past to tell her family stories of loss and resilience. Kiss the Red Stairs, available now wherever books are sold.
So speaking of at the table, I'm not going to not mention your political career. So where are you today?
Boy.
Wait, don't really? Like, so where are you today? You know, I read the news just like everybody else, and I understand there was I'll say a kerfuffle, but you've subsequently resolved it. If you want to delve into, you can say as much or as little as you wish. If you want to delve into what's going on with you in terms of, because I read your statement, you said that you hope that racialized people and Jewish Canadians will still get involved or still support the Conservative Party. And I want to explore what you mean by that statement, dig into that a little bit deeper, and tell me, what are your goals? What are your goals now?
Look, I mean, I'm very much still and will continue to be a party man, right? So, you know, I mean, if we're going to talk politics, I'll complain about the Liberals, the New Democrats, and the Greens all day long. I don't know that that's fair to you or your podcast, right? So I'm still very much part of the Conservative family. I would tell you that, you know, 99.9% of the Conservative family are people that I embrace, you know, and who embrace me with open hearts. I would also say to you, this idea, you know, our activities in community affairs, in public affairs, and in our professions, respectively, is also an intergenerational dialogue. So, you know, I can look towards the past or I can look towards the future. And, you know, in politics, I've spent, you know, countless hours with the youth of the Conservative Party, right? And, you know, I see young people who get it, right? Who are not dealing with the struggles of the past in terms of, you know, arriving at a level of discernment and understanding of, you know, how to be equal citizens and how to support their citizenry with a view of equality, right? And, you know, I think the positive way to be involved in public affairs is really to look towards the future and to support, you know, that generation. And you know, I remember the days when I was in university, and we had a phrase. We said it, to bean or to unbean, right, amongst ourselves. Meaning, is it okay to wear your yarmulke, or are you going to get beaten up if you wear your yarmulke? We were around Concordia, and we're like, oh, no, you know, this is where you need to unbean, right, at this library, because somebody's going to come and beat you up wearing a yarmulke. Right?
Right.
You know,
Okay.
And the geography of Montreal was very much like that. Do you bean or do you unbean? Right? You know, can you be openly be a Jew here or not be openly a Jew here? And you look at, you know, the progression of university life for Orthodox Jews, you know, decades on, and you see that there's been very little progression, you know, in the environment of BDS.
Right.
Where kids are still afraid to bean or to unbean. They're still afraid in political science classes to raise their hands and to say, no, professor, you know, I hope you don't give me a flunking mark because, you know, I happen to be a Zionist and I think you're completely wrong with what you're saying, right?
Right.
You know,
right.
And in that context, you know, I really look at this sometimes as political life and party life as life in shul, right? If you have a shul, you know that we'll have good days and bad days amongst each other. If you have opinions, right, we'll be fighting and this and that.
100%.
But you got to preserve. You can't burn the shul down, right? You know, you need the shul. And, you know, I would advocate always that Jewish Canadians and racialized Canadians we need this party. You know, this is the party that says that BDS is wrong. This is the party where in you know, our kids can feel can go into the youth groups with non-Jewish kids and feel at home and feel protected and feel loved. So you know. Well, but at the same time, remember what I said before, you know, representation can be tokenism. So it's really navigating this really fine line. It's tricky. And it's so hard for all of us. Yeah, you know,
it is tricky.
It's so tricky where, you know, something's wrong and you want to, you know, you got to pipe up. But at the same time, you can't burn the institution. You know, you got to preserve the institution.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's party life. Now, without getting into the latest chapter of my issues in public affairs, because, you know, obviously, you know, I mean, read the newspapers and you'll educate yourself if you want to. But I'm happy to have a greater conversation. about party life, and to say the following. In terms of transparency, in terms of diversity, Canadian institutions have greatly improved over the last couple of decades.
Yes.
There's accountability through the charter, etc. Unions, non-union environments, public companies, private sector companies, government. Government in terms of the civil service, etc. As a lawyer, I hear all the headaches. People come to me, and I certainly know it's not a perfect Mecca, right? But
Right.
you should know that political parties don't have the same type of legal accountability that every other Canadian institutions have, and that's just the law. That's the law how it is. Political parties are like Hashem. The courts do not oversee them at all. They are more powerful. They are more powerful than Parliament, right?
Oh.
You're the prime minister, question period. They'll ask you questions. You've got parliamentary
Right.
committees. There's a level of oversight, if you will, that all political parties in Canada don't have. Okay, they are
That explains a lot.
extremely powerful, and they do what they want. So the idea, go to court, this and that. Yeah, well, no, there is very, very little protection and oversight.
Okay.
And I look, and that explained, and that will explain to you Judy Wilson-Raybould. That will explain to you Selena Chavez. That will
Yeah.
explain to you Anna-May Paul.
Yeah.
It's not about a specific party, okay? It's about the construction of the parties and the institutional power that they have versus every other type of organization. And that's a legal reality in our democracy.
Interesting. Okay.
And so, where am I at with my party? I'm at peace with
Yes.
my party. But I should also
Okay.
tell you that that again, in terms of my party serving the Jewish community, I'm very
Yes.
grateful for how it has been there for our community, the Conservative Party of Canada. I'm also absolutely, convinced that I look at my level of personal freedom that I've been able to achieve in my life. I've been able to achieve it completely in the private sector. I've got genius friends, people who are 10 times smarter than me, racialized individuals who've been in the civil service, who've been working in other institutions, and who really, hit walls that I never had to hit because, for 20 plus years, I've been my own boss, and I've been able to make a living. And as long as my clients are happy and as long as I serve them professionally, in accordance with the rules and ethical standards that you're supposed to, then I have my freedom. And that's a freedom that came to me with the private sector. And I see the benefits of private sector life for me, for many other racialized friends in business, who've been able to, achieve, some of them achieve great wealth that they can, bring back into the community, and that, and help the community, progress, etc. To me, that's democracy and capitalism put together. Those are, the fundamental values of smaller government that comes with conservatism. And so, it's not ideology that's, based on just reading the, great philosophers and great sociologists. It's also ideology that comes from personal experience and the benefits that I've been able to achieve in, in my own life, right? So, in that context, again, there's to me, there's every reason why, yesterday I was a loyal conservative. Today I'm a loyal conservative, and tomorrow I'll be a loyal member of the Conservative Party of Canada. But sometimes in the synagogue the elbows get raised. And it gets a little muscular, but can I tell you? That's the beauty of democracy too, and that's part of the democratic process. And if I'm going to jab, send a jab to the other parties, Judy Wilson-Raybould or Anna-May Paul don't have voices in their own parties today, and in their own ecosystem. They just don't, And so I hope to have a voice in my party today and tomorrow, but clearly. There is a great difficulty in the representation of minorities who just don't want to, fall into token, right?
Right.
But it's, but that's a reality in my view. It's a bigger problem amongst the liberals and the New Democrats and the Greens, if I can send a jab out there. When I ran, I lost. My campaign had my campaign in New York Center, our campaign, had the best results for the Conservative Party of Canada in the 416.
Okay.
We did very, very well, much better than every other other candidacy in other ridings in the 416. Our numbers, we usually do well in the 905. Our numbers were numbers that were similar to 905. But I wanted to win, of course. I came shy, but it was my dream to win. And in my prepared little victory speech, I wanted to pay tribute to Anna May Paul, right? Because I felt that she had gone through so much pain, really, not willing to kowtow to anti-Semitism, to BDS. I mean, I really felt like she held our community on her shoulders.
She did.
And so horribly treated by her party, right? You know what I mean? And so isolated and so alone, broke my heart. So, I mean, had I won, had I been able to give a victory speech, I would have paid absolute tribute to her because.
But you did it here. You did it here.
I've rarely seen in public affairs a person of such integrity and of such courage. Not that I agree with. Not that we share political ideologies.
But you have to respect. But you have to respect what she went through and how she handled it. You have to respect that. Meetings that I was in related to politics, it did come up, that people across party lines were saying, we need to support her and we need to recognize the anti-Semitism that she is experiencing. Regardless of where you stand politically, she is one of us.
She held up. She held up against, forces of anti-Semitism that were incredible and virulent, and at the same time, and this is so interesting sociologically, because when we people of color, racialized Canadians, are attacked, we're attacked very often in the most racist and the most horrible ways, right?
Right.
So we're attacked in the most unfair way on the one hand, but on the other hand, here she is defending the greater Jewish community.
Absolutely.
And so it's almost the idea of is this a fair analogy to say it's like the soldier being on the war front with no shield, no bulletproof vest, no ammunition, and no weapon, taking all the shots.
I think that's kind of perfect.
Right?
I think that's kind of perfect.
I don't know if that's a fair analogy, but then that's why you also pay tribute to that level of courage, right?
Yes.
And you also have to, I think, be very upset with the political class and the media class, not to pick up on that and not to defend her the way she needed to be defended. It felt to me that she was very alone in having to carry all of this. And there was not enough in terms of public affairs. There was not enough voices.
Absolutely.
I feel. I might be wrong. Sometimes institutional support, and it's not echoed in the media, so you don't know. But it just felt to me, in terms of how this all went down,
absolutely.
That here she is.
Joel,
here she is, all alone, taking all the bullets.
Absolutely.
No reason.
I attended the Summit on Anti-Semitism, which I recognize was a partisan event. Okay, whatever. But they asked people from the Jewish community to attend, regardless of our political affiliation. And one of the things that I found disappointed, which one person did raise, he actually helped you on your campaign, and why did his name slip my mind? Anyways, regardless, he did raise it. And it was an important point. The point was, why was she not invited? Here we are talking about anti-Semitism, and a political leader had suffered intense anti-Semitism, and she is not here. It actually spoke volumes to me. It spoke volumes to me, the lack of her presence. And I'll leave that at that.
There's so much work to, internally there's so much work that still needs to be done at the institutional levels of our community infrastructure. Recently I was invited to come in. There was a teacher symposium where they wanted to in the Jewish day school system, and they wanted to speak. They wanted speakers to come and speak about diversity. And I would have been very happy to address tons of issues that relate to experiences that racialized Jewish Canadians are facing within our institutions. And they told me, the mindset was, no, Joel, we just want to acknowledge that there's diversity in the Jewish community. That's all we're going to talk about. I'm like, what? But
like for real?
That's a 30-year-old. Yeah, no, for real. And so I declined participation because, again, for me, that was an exercise in tokenism, right? To
100%.
say, oh, well, in the Jewish...
Yeah, we brought our black Jew here to talk about black Jews.
We have Ethiopian Jews, we have Temani, we have Yemenite, we have North African, we have Ashkenazi, Northern European, Russian. Like really?
Seriously?
You don't think the kids know that already? And this was a symposium for teacher training, right?
No.
So
no.
I'm like, thanks, but no thanks, right?
Thanks, but no thanks is right. And they're going to be the ones who will later say, well, I don't understand why we didn't, and it's like, seriously, do you hear the words coming out of your mouth? It's like, do you hear the words coming out of your mouth? If that's what you wanted to talk about, here's a book. Assign it to the class, assign it to the teachers, read the book and come back. Or do you want, because No, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I'm listening.
No, I was going to say that's the reluctance to get to the root of it and just do this surface stuff where you can pat yourself on the back and say you addressed diversity. It's like, no, you didn't. You just read a book.
The problems in the Jewish community for racialized Jews are the same problems as non-racialized Jews, if you will. Because by the way, if you would ask my grandparents if they were white, they would have told you. My maternal grandparents, they would have told you no. They faced the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
They felt just as racialized. But so sociologically, it's probably not fair to say racialized versus non-racialized, but we understand each other, what we're trying to communicate in the conversation. Right. But the problems that we face are the same as everybody else, insofar as you have an attrition rate of around 50%. Here we are, a nation that is 5,000 years old, that has thousands of years of wisdom and of history and of culture to contribute to the world. I think for me, and this is me perhaps wearing the immigration lawyer hat, I've seen so many beautiful nuances in all the cultures and all the races and all the religions of the world, right? And I think the beauty of the Jewish voice is one that is important for greater society, for the rest of the world to also be able to benefit from the Jewish treasures, just like we should benefit from the treasures that Falun Gong practitioners have to bring, or the Brazilians have to bring, right. But it's important for all of us to have a voice in that world, and when you have to be part of that global voice, and then when you have an attrition rate of 50%, that's also a reality for our children. And, making sure that they live in an ecosystem where they can find their comfort in living a Jewish life as a go forward, for my children and for my grandchildren is critical at a time of great, at a time where, and I've seen it as a small town Jew. When I was a kid, the Halifax community was the big community in Atlantic Canada, right? Shul, shul on Shabbat, whether there's a conservative shul and there's a conservative shul and an Orthodox shul. So, there would have never been an issue about having a minyan on Shabbat. There would have never been a problem about having, a proper minyan, in either of the shuls during the high holidays, right? And you see how it's in the smaller communities that you see what that 50% attrition rate actually means, right? Of people, no longer participating, where you see these buildings that are, that were built with the blood and sweat and tears of people who were oppressed and who still managed to scrimp and put some wealth together and gave it back in the kindest ways. And then you have empty buildings, right. 2 generations in, right? Where
later,
right? And so I see two things in this discussion. I see the critical nature of making sure that the ecosystem is one that is healthy for just as healthy for folks who've been here for 5 generations as it is for racialized Jewish Canadians, as it is for Israeli Canadians. There's a big attrition rate in the Israeli Jewish community, by the way.
Yes, I do know.
Higher numbers than other aspects of our community, and I see this as critical because having a healthy Canadian Jewish jury is not just important for Canadian jury and for our children and grandchildren. It's important for the rest of the planet. It's important. It helps. Canada is a member of NATO. Canada is a G20 country. You want to have a healthy Jewish community in Canada. You can't have a Jewish world that is just New York and Tel Aviv, right? That's not going to be healthy, for the future, right? So, and you need to have healthy Jewish voices in London, in Paris, in Toronto, and if we're not preoccupied, in having healthy ecosystems, Reform, conservative, Orthodox, ultra Orthodox, it doesn't matter to me, but healthy Jewish ecosystems, then we're facing some serious problems. By the way, I should tell you, just to segue, I have a good friend of mine who's Zoroastrian.
Okay.
Have you heard of the Zoroastrians?
Yes, I have.
The Zoroastrians are they're an ancient monotheistic faith, and their faith is 2,000 years older than Judaism. Yeah. And my friend is probably part of the last generation of Zoroastrians.
Wow.
There will probably be no Zoroastrians left a generation from now.
Right.
As from my friend and his friends, telling me. And you have it's a community with great wealth, by the way. It's a great institutional wealth, but they need people. They don't have the people. And I think when you're involved in public affairs and in Jewish public affairs, what we need to worry about is the funding for next year, BDS, anti-Semitism on campus, all the tons of issues. But we have also a greater responsibility to be cognizant of what the next 50 years or 100 years are going to look like for our community, and that's we have a serious responsibility on our shoulders. Do you know that demographically, somebody said something interesting to me, like I haven't verified it, but in terms of numbers, while most communities in the world, most demographics in the world have been able to, post World War II, were able to flourish and have much larger numbers than the numbers of people they had pre-World War II. So notwithstanding the deaths and the trauma of World War II, they've been able to transcend that. I think our numbers in the Jewish community are still below or at the same level that they were before the Second World War.
That's frightening.
Okay, so
because that's like, we don't want to be
there's a lot of
model.
Well, it would be to the world. You look at our contributions, where like these little Monctonians who punch beyond, above their weight class.
Right, yeah.
In Nobel prizes and in scientific discoveries, and look at Israel in high tech and everything that Israel has been able to do, especially over the last 40 years. It's just miracle after miracle after miracle. And you're saying, does the world not benefit from our presence? Don't we have something to contribute to the world, right?
Of course,
and
we know that.
If you're Jewish in your side, it's what to do. You look. And by the way, the issue of diversity and multiculturalism in Judaism is nothing new. You know that at the turn of the century, 1905, 1910, 1915, great periods of nationalism, right? Mm-hmm. And you would read, nationalist writer after nationalist writer, whether German thinkers, Italian thinkers, and what was the premise, right? The premise was our nation is fantastic, it's the best, it should be the ruling nations of the world because we have these immutable qualities, etc., etc. Our blood is better blood, etc. That was the ethnic nationalism of Europe, right? Mm-hmm. And you read Old New Land of Herzl. Again, if it was 1908, 1910 that he wrote this novel, but Herzl was writing of a country that would have gender equality, racial equality. I mean, his utopian vision of nationalism was multi-ethnic. It was multicultural at a time when nobody on the planet was thinking that.
Nope. Mm-hmm. That's impressive.
So it's not new. The voice that we're espousing is it's a Herzlian voice.
I have learned so much from you. I'm actually jotting that down because I didn't think I didn't know that aspect of Herzl. You know, when we think of Herzl, we think of Herzl, Zionist movement.
Well,
that's it.
Because you've got
mostly, right?
You've got the canards of the anti-Semites, right? And those who hate Zionism and hate Jews, right? Who try to paint it as ethnic nationalism.
Yeah.
Herzl, the last thing he was thinking about was ethnic nationalism. I mean,
Exactly.
it was in writing, and he built, and it wasn't in hiding. You know, it was the novel in writing, public, and he brought masses of our people to this vision, into this ideology that eventually created a country based on that.
There you go.
Based on multiculturalism. You think, 1982, the Charter of Rights, and you think, 1960s, Canadian multiculturalism, etc. Nothing new. Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's the only way for the world to become a world of peace and harmony amongst the nations. No doubt about it. But, I'm proud to say that in that voice, in that public affairs, public voice, we were the first at the table.
Yeah, clearly. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Before we conclude, though,
Thank you.
I need to ask you, okay, so it's not as heavy as what we've been talking about, but maybe it is. I don't know. Tell me about the rabbi's daughter.
It's the rabbi's daughters, by the way.
Daughters. Plural. Oh, yeah, I'm missing my S on the end. Sorry.
Daughters. And the plurality of it is important. I'll give you the narrative premise. You have the leader of the Orthodox Jewish community, rabbi, and his wife, who want to have a Passover amongst family because the rabbi's wife is dying of cancer, and a decade and a half passed. Their daughter left Orthodox Judaism, married interracially, and now the family has decided that they want to have one last Seder with both daughters and the spouses together at the same table. And so that's the narrative premise. Orthodox and non-Orthodox, multicultural and diverse and non-diverse, everybody speaking truth to each other at the table. The religious perspective, the non-religious perspective, the multicultural perspective, the more ethnic nationalist perspective, if you will. And it's all there in one sitting, under one Passover dinner.
Wow.
And, yeah. Oh, yeah. And look, I mean, I wrote the screenplay, and I wrote it in response to what I see as a lot of tokenism in the depiction of Jewish life in film and television. Because what film and television just does, in my view, two things in terms of especially Jewish Orthodox life. It either paints Jewish Orthodox life as a horrendous life where people are shackled and they have no ability to self-actualize. And then you've got the religious Jewish person who leaves Orthodox Judaism and then finds now a forum for self-actualization and, giving a utopic vision of modern secular life that I think is not realistic either. Modern secular life full of challenges, especially for women, right? And, for people of color as well, It's not the panacea that it claims to be. So that's one vision of movies and television that showcases Jewish life nowadays. And the other vision is the opposite, right? Completely the opposite, which is, that Jewish traditional life, Orthodox life is perfect, and so you've got it's the other way around. You've got a person living in the secular world who, needs to find the oasis in the desert and then finds Orthodox Judaism and life is perfect. And I've spent enough time in my life in all communities amongst all the peoples of the planet to know that, ecosystems and sociological structures are what they are, and none of them are really perfect, and there's truths to be told in every forum. And that's what I try to do in The Rabbi's Daughters. They tell each other's truths. It's not always easy for each other, for the characters to hear it. But I think, my goal, and I hope the audience, once they've seen the movie, will see that what was said was honest, right? Okay. And truthful. And that's my goal, yeah.
So when can we, because you said just this past few months ago you finished directing it. When is it?
I just finished directing it in January, so we're still in post-production.
Okay, so speed it up.
As soon as I've got a release date, I'll let you know. But
please,
I'm still in the meat and the bones of it.
Yeah. Because I'm already thinking premiere. I'm already out there already thinking about.
A little for you. You've got front row seats, so you don't have to worry. I'll absolutely get you some tickets.
Let's take that nepotism a little further for your next project, and I need to be in it.
Hey, very happy, very happy.
I'll be a silent extra, drinking coffee somewhere. I'll do a walk by on the street.
If you want to say some lines, not a problem. We can organize that. That's for sure.
Okay. Well, on that note, as I now envision my career as a superstar, I'm just joking. But on that note, I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much, Joel. You have enlightened me. I have taken notes because I need to do some homework. You gave a different perspective on my hometown. And I'm so happy to have had this conversation with you. So again, thank you. And we will touch base 100%.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thanks for listening to Riv Kush. Our producer is Michael Freeman. Music by Westside Gravy, and I am Riv Kush. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can hear more at thecjn.ca/RivKush and support us by subscribing. If you want to support the CJN, join the CJN Circle. You get quarterly magazines, invitations to live events, and a weekly printable edition. Learn more at thecjn.ca/circle. Thanks for listening.
This episode has been brought to you by Looking Back, Moving Forward, 160 Years of Jewish Life in BC. Published by the Jewish Museum and Archives of British Columbia for their 50th anniversary, this elegant volume is a once-in-a-generation collection of Jewish life and history throughout the province. Order your copy today at jewishmuseum.ca.